Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I've entitled this podcast, What You Don't Know. Now, there's obviously a lot that we don't know about the world, about the universe, about things, but I'm going to limit this to a person, somebody who is in your experience, and you may see this person day in and day out. But you experience something about them in terms of, say, mood swings. And, you know, there's a lot that's been said about nutrition, about medications that people take, just the day-to-day things about life can affect a person. But when you think about the story of someone's life, where they've been, their travels, and I think we all understand how something in our past affects our behavior. It affects our belief system, you know, that whole thing. This topic was brought about today because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. And the story was, and I say, well, they're a friend of mine. They're a new friend. We both know a particular person, but it is their recent experience with meeting this person gave them the impression that, wow, this person isn't very nice. And I'm just kind of paraphrasing there. So you get the contrast. Now, I know this this individual, and I'm not saying that they are warm and fuzzy, but they're not a mean person. They're just somebody that just has a different cut on life. And their way of expressing it is their way of expressing it. Some people might call it abrupt, but it's not warm and fuzzy. And when you first meet someone like that, and if you're the warm and fuzzy type, well, this person is going to be a little bit off-putting. Because I think we all meet someone and then try to figure out, you know, where's the center? You know, how do we communicate with each other? And in this experience that my friend had, they just kind of felt like, wow, I don't know that I'm going to really spend a lot of time talking with that person. But again, their take on this individual is that they weren't very nice. They weren't very friendly. And I get that, because there was a time or two when I felt the same way about this person. And of course, at that time, I didn't know a lot about them, but I know enough about human behavior to settle in on a few ideas, but knowing that this person isn't going to be one of my favorite people. But for the purposes of this explanation, I'm going to explain that what was behind this perception of my friend, the one who had just met the person, was they want to have as little interaction with them as possible. So I proposed the idea that, you know what, there's more going on with this person than meets the surface. And I think all of us experience people who can be a bit off-putting. And we probably feel in ourselves that we might like to ask a lot of questions, but then, you know, we kind of think, well, I wouldn't want people asking questions of me and my personal life and what's going on. Some things are very on the surface. You can look at somebody and there are a lot of things that are on the surface that you can make some snap judgments about it, and probably pretty spot on. Other things, not so much. Because I think all of us as human beings tend to wear a mask. We hide our hurts, our fears, and we parade around as if we have all of our needs met or can take care of ourselves. We're not vulnerable. All of those things. See, that's a mask. And if you meet anybody that parades around that way, just know that that's an exterior. And we grow that in order to protect ourselves, because there's lots of things that happen out there in the world than the way we experience it, and we don't want to get harmed. Now, when you carry that as an exterior, now know for yourself this. If you carry that exterior, that I'm not going to be vulnerable, other people are picking up on that. And it can be very off-putting. So if you're trying to attract someone, if you're trying to be interesting, trying to be attractive, those kinds of things, then you're going to have a lot of work to do, because you're going to have to soften that up. But back to my point about how my friend interpreted this new introduction about this person, which I didn't go into a whole lot of detail in the very beginning with my friend and who she met, or he met. But it was just to explain that there's a lot going on behind the scenes about why this person behaves the way they do. And the thing that happens, and I think this happens to a lot of us, is when we get a perception in our head about somebody, unless we learn something that's really significant, we pretty much don't change our minds about them. I always like to encourage people to have an open mind. I mean, don't just settle on your first perception about someone. They say don't judge a book by its cover. I wholeheartedly believe that. And I also do believe in giving people second chances. They say you can't change a first impression when you meet somebody. I believe you can do a restart, a do-over. I try to be pretty forgiving, because I tend to like that for myself, because I'm sure that there are times when I have not come off as being the person I think that I am to someone, and I like to do a restart. So in that experience of learning what's going on in somebody else's life, if they're willing to share, I think that reveals a lot about why people behave the way they do. When they're really willing to share some details, and I don't mean just spout opinion about things, because people tend to do that in general, but I mean really tell something about your story. Meaning, if you were a little kid and you rode your bike and you fell down and you got hurt, you broke your arm or something significant, that's the significant stuff that people can talk about. And you can learn to have some compassion for somebody that suffered through that. And it's those kinds of stories, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of how people are, how their psyche is constructed, how they're created, their childhood, what experiences did you have when you were in school? Did you get picked to be on the dodgeball team or the kickball team or the baseball team or the volleyball team, or did you have to stand on the sidelines and did you feel excluded? All of these things shape our experience. And when people are willing to share those kinds of details, now it takes a little while to get personal with somebody. I mean, some people aren't just going to start talking about that right off the top. But remember, you have to invest yourself in that too. If you want to learn that about someone else, you got to be willing to share a little bit of the details of your own life. I mean, that's the way to go about it. But having grasped that information, then you begin to learn what you don't know, which could then explain that initial impression that you got. Remember, it's your impression that you have, and that's what we're working on here. Why you feel the way you do. And through this, I hope that we can learn to develop some compassion and not react because something doesn't set well with us the first time we take a look at it. And it's very easy to be reactive on those first impressions. I'm going to take a break, and I'm going to come back and talk about this some more. Stay tuned. Hello, and we're back. This is John Johnson, and you're listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I'm talking about what you don't know. Now, when I left off, I was explaining how we get a perception of someone, and those first impressions are pretty long-lasting. And when we want to change those impressions, meaning let's say it's you and you've left an impression on someone and you want to change that, it's quite a bit of work to do that. But what you're hoping for is your listener, your audience, let's just say it that way, is going to be receptive to your change. Because they say, and it's just one of those cliches about, it's hard to make a first impression, a second first impression. I think that's how it goes, or something to that effect. It's very difficult to make a second first impression. And by illustrating that, it's where when you have that impression of someone, how often do we let that go? And if you're not having a good experience with someone, are you willing to do a restart, to reset the experience? And as I was telling you the story about a friend of mine who met someone for the first time and didn't get a very good impression, I know a little bit about that person who didn't give the good impression. And I'm not using names because if they happen to listen to the podcast, I don't want them to think that I was spotlighting them. But I think you can follow along. What I know about the person who didn't give a very good impression was that they have some personal challenges that definitely colors their behavior. And this is something I want everyone to look at in terms of their experience with someone that you may have had, even at one time, an exceptional relationship with this person, but for some reason, things tend to be going astray, things tend to be going off, and you don't know why. You may even ask the question, hey, is everything all right? But, what do most people do? Most people say, yeah, I'm okay. They don't really divulge much. And remember when I was talking in that first segment about how much people really share, and if you want people to share, you probably have to take the lead on that. And I find that the amount that you're willing to share kind of sets that expectation. And you can go further and further and further into this. It takes time, but you can learn a lot about people if you're willing to share. Or willing to be a good listener. How about that part? So in this experience that I observed, I knew that the person had health challenges, which then makes them appear to be very grumpy and not very approachable. And almost, for some people who they tend to be more the happy type, a person like that could just seem downright mean at times and uncaring. And in my own experience with someone else that, I felt I knew pretty well, I had an encounter, someone that I had known for years. And the experience that I had really shocked me because it was, like I said, somebody I had known for several years, went to have a conversation with them, and it was a very simple case of, well, they had a couple of pets, a couple of dogs. The dogs actually got loose and started circling me, and I was a little bit concerned because our conversation, as it started out, was through a security door. I was knocking, saying hi, chit-chatting, and they opened the door to to come outside. The dogs got loose. They started circling around, and I was obviously very concerned. And this gentleman, he didn't have control over his animals, and because I was more alarmed, he got upset at me for being alarmed that his dogs actually seemed to be out of control. Now, if you can imagine, I don't know these animals, and they were not very nice. So he was finally able, after yelling at them a number of times, able to get them back in the house. But as you can imagine, it was fairly disturbing to be in that situation, because I wasn't quite cornered, but I was definitely backing away. And his reaction to me being upset that the dogs came toward me really surprised me. And instead of him understanding my situation, he got very upset with me. Now imagine this in your setting when you're being, say, approached by someone's animal. And these weren't small dogs, and I'm talking there were 2 of them. Well, it wasn't a very nice ending, if you can imagine. So I just basically walked away. I didn't say anything that I would have to apologize for later. I just said, well, something really awkward just happened here. Well, I later on found out from the man's wife that he had a brain tumor, which really affected his ability to understand why I was alarmed and why that I was backing away. The brain tumor was in the frontal lobe. And for those of you that understand what that does, that affects behavior. Now, I'm not an expert on this in any way, shape, or form, but I have talked to people who are, and I was amazed to understand that, because this wasn't the first person who I've known that had a tumor on their frontal lobe. A couple of other people that I've known many years, one who has actually passed away a couple of years ago, I saw his behavior change over a period of time. I mean, demonstrably so. That I still had a good relationship with him up until he had passed away. But I did see the changes in the behavior. And now I knew that this individual, because, by then I had kind of educated myself as to what happens to people when they have tumors, and especially in that portion of the brain. Prior to that, obviously I didn't know. Like I said, this in the first story that I was telling you about, where the gentleman and the dogs, where they were pretty much going to attack me, and his reaction to that, like I said, I was very surprised. I mean, I really couldn't even talk to him about it. I wound up talking to his wife, learning something about what was going on for him, and then was able to put 2 and 2 together because of this other person that I knew that had a brain tumor, and then again, finding out that the man with the dogs had the brain tumor in the frontal lobe. It affected his behavior. And I say all that to help you understand, you as a listener, help you understand that when people are behaving in ways that just seem contrary to what you think people would normally behave, they may have something going on in life. And don't take it personal. That's part of the message here. Don't take it personal. Maybe being compassionate might be a real challenge for you at that moment, especially if that individual is maybe saying something that's not very nice, and it being directed at you. That might be really difficult, but you don't have to necessarily be in reaction mode to this. Think about it in these terms, and psychologists talk about this from time to time. They say, if you're having an experience with someone, you say something to them, and their reaction to what you're saying is just well beyond a reasonable reaction to what you're saying. They probably had some other issues that are affecting them, and it all came out at that time. I call that misguided anger. They may have already been upset about something, and now it's all being directed at you. I mean, that can be very hard to take, but that's something I'm going to talk about in a moment. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back. Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about what you don't know. And I should finish that off by saying what you don't know about somebody else. Because as I've illustrated in the examples of people that I have met, or in part of the first segment, it was somebody who had met somebody that I knew, but I knew that person had a history of some health challenges, and that colors their way of relating to people. Because in my own experience of that person, I thought that some things about myself that I had merited some acknowledgement for having done a good job. Didn't get the acknowledgement that I had expected. Now, I wasn't going to let that stop me being who I was, but I did realize that this person that I'm speaking about had their own troubles. And for what it was worth, I said, you know what, that is going to probably prevent them from seeing me for who I am. So I had to take ownership of that and recognize that I wasn't going to get the acknowledgement or the appreciation for who I am from that individual. But, you know, that's life. We take it and we go on. But think about that from the standpoint of yourself. And if people seem not to really understand you, or maybe seem they're put off by how you're being, it could be because there is something affecting you and how you're relating to them. Maybe you're not feeling well. And that's to say, we have to take ownership for who we're being when we do that, and recognize that we're communicating what we're about a lot more often and a lot deeper than we recognize at the time. It's usually in retrospect. We might have a conversation with someone and they say, well, remember that time when you were, behaving in a peculiar way? And you might think back, oh yeah, I wasn't really feeling good that day. I mean, how many times in our lives has that happened? So the trick here is, remember that when you're having an experience of someone and things aren't going well. Now, there are times I think it's almost natural to say, hey, are you okay? You know, people give that throwaway answer, yeah, I'm fine. But they're not. Maybe they want to talk about it. Maybe you can get them to open up, and maybe not. Some people are really closed off. And as I shared, sometimes if you want to learn more about people, then you might have to do a little bit of sharing to get them to open up. Because one of the things that I know, about myself in particular, is I'm not really going to say a lot unless I find that somebody's really interested in knowing about me. Because it's, how often do people pretend to care about how we feel or what we're thinking? We're human beings. What do? We do a lot of, hey, how are you? We know. Do we really want to know how somebody's doing? Do we really want to take that time to listen to what's really going on with them? Or do we just want to say that and just keep going on? Many people are of the belief that they don't really want to know what's going on. That's just a throwaway line. And it's learning to take that beat to really listen to somebody's reaction and take the time to know the answer when you ask, hey, how are you doing? Wait for that reaction. See what's really going on. If they're doing okay, great. But if you kind of sense, no, they're just saying, hey, I'm all right, stop and pause a minute and find out what's going on. I have done that a number of times, and it has really helped build a better connection between myself and people who didn't know me very well. If just for the simple fact that prior to really asking how someone is doing? Do you really know? Sometimes we can figure it out with body language. Some people you can really read just right off the top. Other people, not so. Again, because we're wearing masks. We hide behind things because that's our safe space. And I think we go around wondering who really cares about us. Because for now, when you reach a point in life where you think you kind of understand some of the ins and outs, you realize relationships are not very easily made and maintained. Maintenance on a relationship can be a very daunting thing to do. And relationships suffer from neglect all the time. I mean, think of something that you own that is shiny new when you first got it, from the time you first got it. If it's not wrapped in a package somewhere where you're keeping it from being exposed, it's probably got some tarnish on it or some dust or something like that. And relationships are the same way. You have to nurture them. And by that, you're going to learn what you don't know when you take the time to find out. So it's about that human connection. It's about the value of the relationship you have with someone, even a stranger. I do know the power of making a difference in someone's life who you don't know, the power of a smile, and taking a moment to see how someone is doing. It's one of those things that I believe you can pay it forward. I do believe in what goes around comes around. And partly because it's the attitude that you carry, it's sort of boomerangs. It's more direct. It's not just put out there into the world like just put out there, but it has to do with the energy that you cause or the energy that you emit creates a reaction. Some people don't react the way you expect them to, and you might get a little surprise, and it might not be a nice surprise. But for those that, when you get the nice surprises, you could be in a really funky mood, and then somebody reacts with kindness. And sometimes at that moment, you can see yourself and how you're being, and you soften. It changes you. Those are the moments in life when you think about how you're being and how you could be better, how you could be nicer, more thoughtful. And I believe in hanging on to those things that you learn in those moments because they can be very transformative. Remember when I said something about don't judge a book by its cover? Many times, those covers, the exterior, be it a person who has the appearance of someone who you might be afraid of, could wind up being one of the most insightful, kindest, most warm individuals. That's happened to me. And I have been the benefit of many acts of kindness. And I'm so very grateful for having learned this lesson over and over. And it has helped me to be very considerate, less judgmental. And I've learned something about my own biases or my preconceived notions about things. And I know that's a very human thing to be that. But I'm trying to be better at being a better example of who I want to be. And I know that kindness really does matter. It does have an effect on people. So one of the takeaways here is when something's going on with another person and you, it doesn't necessarily mean that you did something wrong. They could really be having a rough day, and it can be all about what's happening in their world, and you might have an opportunity to figure out what is going on with them. They could share with you what's happening, which could be very insightful, and by and large, could help them turn around and mirror the kindness that you've just shown to them. That's a great gift. And you learn what you don't know. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Thank you for listening.